Hello all, and I'm going to try to record this without dying as there's a very windy storm going on outside right now. But anyway, I wanted to get back to form on the channel and do a good old fashioned schizo post for you guys and link together a bunch of abstract ideas and concepts together with real life events and, just give the classic good old bongo fun on the channel. So I wanted to start off really with a basic definition. I wanted to start off with a definition of what news is on its surface. And so news is really just the kind of chronology of events that we give attention to. It's dispersed, of course, through information, and we sort of privilege these events based on what interest could be. I think that that's a pretty agreed upon definition. And so, really, though, when you think about it, though, news has this creative aspect to it. While they are reporting on supposedly objective events in the real world, they are ultimately crafting a sort of narrative, a sort of causal linkage by necessity, simply by choosing to report what they choose to report on, the disbursement of information in that sort of sense. And so it's kind of has this sort of judgmental aspect that we look towards patterns. And patterns, of course, has the implications of ideology. I think that in order for a ideology in the 21st century to really have a sort of impact, it would require the transmission and access for millions of people in a sort of collaboration way. So obviously a message like that requires quite the dilution. You're probably not going to go around sharing 30-minute very hard entry-level videos on theory. It's going to be much more sloganeering and so forth. And so, really, though, ideology kind of works as a sort of synthetic driver that bridges together particular events. But of course, the problem is that for decades now one of the assumption that we had this sort of impartial process that the media could represent us in these different formats, whether they complement us on our ideological suppositions to satisfy them, whether you want to say in a market sort of way. Nonetheless, though, it requires a sort of medium to synthesize and distribute that information to make it intelligible to us, to narrative craft in that sort of sense. And so I think that it's important to perhaps understand that this is what we're really kind of up against when you go on social media and have to deal with your thoughts being heretical or heresy and trying to avoid banning. It's this sort of medium of what is allowed, what isn't allowed within discourse that ultimately starts with this sort of distribution of information, at least in my mind. And of course, you could point to different ways how that comes about. Of course, the media itself is more important than the message, if you want to ask someone like Marshall McLuhan, of course. But I also think that it's kind of interesting to look at Silicon Valley and their ideological suppositions and what I think we kind of struggle with in the circles around here, understanding that the material world, the sort of, as we looked at on the channel with someone like George Berkeley perhaps, the sort of materialistic boogeyman that gets thrown around in our circles, if you will. I'm not saying that materialism is based or anything by any stretch, but what I'm really saying is that our enemies in Silicon Valley they aren't really interested in the material world. It seems that they're trying to get us into the metaverse, as you've seen lately with their projects. And so I think that kind of draws into the implications of the world we see around us today, where if we have a digitized space that can actually not face the consequences of the material world, can really distort the difference between what is supposedly objectively out there in the real world and what's in our own minds. And something like technology is, in a way, kind of the difference now. And in many ways, it seems like, despite the distance perhaps not appearing to be the same as it ever was, perhaps we've magnified ourselves with a sort of exhaustion of sensory output on the internet, as I've talked about before, with we're constantly being milked for emotional reactions to clickbait headlines, to antagonistic firms that want to do us harm. How do we actually build ourselves to repel that? How do we actually help our friends and family get away from that? That's, of course, something that I think is really important to get on. And you kind of have this sort of, I don't know what you would call it, almost a kind of hedonistic square box of just never-ending sensories that can distort what actually works, as it were, in that sort of empirical, agreed-upon standard sense. If we can all obviously point to particulars and viral hits all day of something objectively happening, how do we actually contract against these narratives and dispense of them, and actually reach out and make inroads towards people that don't necessarily align with our ideas by association or something like that. But how do we actually deal with something like that? And I'm not really sure that it can be in the kind of mass democracy that and global system that we have right now, where you definitely see that there is an advantage towards these kind of ideological platitudes towards a means and an end within ideology's own engine. And this is very easy to obviously see us all do in that kind of sense, since a mass democracy or a sort of mass collusion, if you will, on an outgroup, it makes sense why we would go to these like extremes of ideological scarecrowing and really taking the kind of high school experience of public school and how that can actually be used as a kind of unified experience in this kind of democracy that we have today, where the kind of high school cafeteria, for the most part, is something that everyone kind of experiences, until maybe more recently, of course, in the last couple of years. But so this kind of makes it easier to build these sort of mass democratic narratives of what your ideology or what the proponents are trying to get you to vote for or support or contribute to the narrative at hand. And there was actually a really good thread about this in particular that Yerk P, I hope I'm saying that right, P. Yerk said on Twitter, and if I could bring that up real quick. Really the goal is that media, or the mediums between technology, as we talked about, this sort of distribution of information, they want us to believe that this is just a natural and kind of impartial way of agreeing upon goalposts on information. And so anything that's outside of it obviously can be called fake news or simply not worth entertaining at all to begin with, since it doesn't really tickle your lens of ideology. And obviously, out of that, if you're not in tune towards specific ideologies within an algorithm, then how are you going to pursue patterns or theory really in a meaningful way that can actually be used to help each other, since pattern recognition is frowned upon and kind of in the way that information is being transmitted if it's decided upon that it's not within those goalposts. It's going to be much harder to be able to distribute those sort of patterns out and uses for people to collude in these kind of ideological schemes. And I also think that perhaps really to add a bow on this with technology and scientism kind of being used almost as through the avenues of technology to justify itself and the notion of progress and whatnot. You can see though that with Kant, as we've been talking about and going over his critiques in the next couple weeks, I think it's important to maybe draw as an aside here, just as a little interesting point to add in here, that all of the boundaries that he set forth for metaphysical beliefs, all of the antinomies, as it were, are being overran and have been overtaken by scientism. Scientism is taking the role of religion that Kant said shouldn't be happening, and technology is definitely playing a part in that. And of course, when it comes to media and information within these realms of technology, we have to be able to outdo these journalists quite literally with better and more distributed patterns and recognition. This is why, of course, they get so salty about meme culture, memes, and how powerful they can be with just the most minute points of interest between a subject or something. How we can agree upon patterns and share that sort of symbolism. It's a very powerful thing that I don't think has been totally exhausted yet. And we can also remember, perhaps when we were younger, certainly in my age group, as I'm approaching 30 now, you can remember perhaps when you were a child and the home computer was being introduced to you, and you were told this line often that on the internet there's this kind of free flowing of information, and you could debate whether or not we had something as close to that as we could have at the time, or whether it was imperfect or not. Nonetheless, though, we can't deny that mediums weren't still narrative crafting, even if it was something more or less considered impartial or ideological at that specific time. It was still happening nonetheless, even if it was a laissez-faire position. I think it's important to perhaps shoehorn that in here and see what I mean by that, is that even if we were supposed to come upon this sort of impartial, natural way of narrative crafting, or that there is no narrative to craft, and these are all just facts suspended that we can all just agree upon different policies at different times based off of that, even that itself requires a narrative to uphold, and I think that's important to point out here. And so I think getting a hold of these sort of nozzles, if you will, of information, or creating these sort of patterns that are useful, is really going to be what helps get us into what I hope is the next political epoch that could hopefully change the world quite literally. Of course, I know this is very idealistic and even romantic to some degree, but I do think that there is something to whether or not you think it's that profound or not. There is definitely something to be said about I still think that with regards to the future on the internet, or just the future generations in general in the political and social spheres, whoever can build something out of this is what is going to get ahead in the next century or so, is what I truly believe, and why I think that this video is important. But yeah, this is just a good old-fashioned ring-around post of different things I've been thinking about in regards to us on the right, if you will, needing to play this role of narrative crafting in these technological spheres, despite all of the problems with censorship and what that entails. I hope you guys really think about this kind of stuff and consider subscribing and contributing to the discussion at hand. But thanks for watching, guys, and I hope you guys have been enjoying the holiday season. Hopefully I don't blow away here, but thanks for watching.